Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on how governments can use economic stimulus strategies to reshape their economies, reducing carbon emissions while building up their environmentally sustainable industries to drive future growth. I'm Catherine Early, freelance journalist and editor chairing the event for Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants around the world. We've organised this webinar because the COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted huge economic damage around the world, with millions out of work or with reduced hours. But with crisis comes opportunity, and as governments attempt to revive their stalled economies with stimulus packages worth $10 trillion in the first couple of months alone, some are taking the opportunity to undertake a more thorough overhaul. By ploughing investments into public transport, renewable power generation, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles, some nations are pursuing green recoveries, hoping to restore growth and create new jobs while hitting carbon emissions targets and retooling their economies around the growth industries of tomorrow. With legacy industries dependent on taxpayer support, while many green technologies reach maturity and cost parity, there has never been a better opportunity to shift decisively into a post-carbon world. But this approach throws up big questions. Might green recoveries get off the ground more slowly than fossil fuel-based ones? What mechanisms and strategies would best stimulate sustainable growth? And how can nations reshape their economies without abandoning the communities dependent on carbon-intensive industries? This webinar brings together senior civil servants, technical professionals, and policy specialists from around the world to explore the decisions facing governments as they consider whether to jumpstart their stalled economies or to change the engine of growth. Over the next 75 minutes, we'll consider some of the policies and investments governments are making to promote green growth. Before going any further, I want to thank our knowledge partner, Deloitte, whose support enables us to offer this webinar free to public servants. And to our panel, we have Dr. Stefan Jenner, a policy advisor in the Energy and Climate Policy Unit of the Federal Ministry of Finance, Germany. He was previously a policy advisor to the Federal Foreign Office, the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, and the Federal Ministry for the Environment. Dr. George Dibb is the head of Industrial Strategy and Policy Engagement at University College London Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. He coordinates academic policy engagement from across UCL into UK government's industrial strategy. Dan Markham is a partner in the financial advisory practice and the national leader of the Asset and Economic Advisory Practice of Deloitte, and has advised Canadian government departments on green recovery. Dr. Laura Altinger is the regional team lead for the United Nations Development Programme Nature, Climate and Energy team covering Europe and Central Asia. Laura is responsible for advisory services on issues including natural capital, climate change, energy, green economy, chemicals and waste, water and oceans, and forest conservation. Sir Suma Chakrabarti is a board trustee and soon to be chair of think tank, the Overseas Development Institute. He is also a global commissioner of the New Climate Economy Network and a member of the Clean Growth Leadership Network. He's recently left the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where he served 2 terms as president. The webinar will begin with short presentations from our panelists and then move on to questions. If you have any questions for the panel, please click on the Q&A button at the foot of the Zoom window and type them in. I'll be keeping an eye on that and we'll try and save plenty of time for audience questions. And with that, Dr. Stefan Jenner, it's over to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to tell you a little bit about the recovery program that was adopted in Germany in June, so it's already in place. Let's jump right into it. The program contains 57 measures and a financial volume of 130 billion euros for this year and the next year. These measures fall into 2 big packages or baskets. The first package is a short-term stabilization package in order to prevent an economic collapse and also to restart the German economy, in particular the demand side. In this short-term stabilization package, among other things, there is the reduction of sales tax, financial support for small companies, or also a bonus to families. And besides that short-term package, the recovery program also consists of a future package. The future package is supposed to support the recovery in the mid and long term and also help to decarbonize our economy. So I think most interesting for this discussion is the future package. So let's have a closer look at that. So the selection of measures for this future package, at least at a working level, was guided by three main principles. I would call them acceleration, scaling up, and prevention. So acceleration means to move investment forward or to pull investment forward on the timeline that we would have to do anyway on the road to a carbon neutral economy in 2050. So among the acceleration measures, so to say, there is a new investment into hydrogen infrastructure and production facilities, investment in public charging stations for electricity mobility, investment in public transportation and the electrification of the railway system, and many other more investment-heavy measures. So all these measures in the acceleration baskets, we probably would have done anyway in the next couple of years or 10 or 20 years, but we do them now in order to let them support the recovery. The second basket I'd coin a scaling up basket. That means taking existing climate policy measures that we know worked really well in the past and increase their funding or extend who is eligible to receive funding from these programs. For example, energy efficiency measures in the building sector or were increased, or projects that try to digitalize the electricity system were scaled up, or the bonus for buying an electric car was doubled. So in order to understand this scaling up approach, I think it's important to know that there has been a big climate policy program of around 100 measures 1 year ago already. So we could use these measures, look what worked, and scale these measures up. So there's certainly some degree of path dependency in the recovery package that comes from existing climate policy. And the third basket of the future package I'd call prevention, and that means to try to counter or to balance effects that are caused or that would have been caused by the corona crisis that would have threatened or would have reversed achievements in climate policy from the past. One example, due to the corona crisis and also some specialities in the German electricity market, the electricity price would have gone up in the corona crisis, and that would have made renewable electricity less competitive against fossil energies, especially in the transportation and in the housing sector. So one measure of this prevention basket was therefore to cap the renewable energy levy that is usually paid by all the households in order to not let the electricity price go up too much, and therefore in a way prevent electricity from becoming less competitive in comparison to fossil alternatives. Tricky measure, but I hope you understand what I mean. Yeah, so these are the three principles that I think try, or at least partly explain what kind of measures in the end made it into the future package and therefore made it into the recovery program. And I'm happy to discuss whatever questions you have about the German recovery package and all the ongoings around that. So thanks a lot.
Great, thanks very much for that, Stefan. That's really interesting. I think it'd be great to hear a bit more about that in the discussion later about this very specific package that you put together there. We're now moving on to Dr. George Dibb.
Great, thank you, and hello to all the participants, and thank you to the hosts for inviting me to speak at this. My role is Head of Industrial Strategy and Policy Engagement at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So I'm going to say a little bit about the Institute and our work just in my opening comments now. But we're a research institute at the university, but we are really closely engaged with policymakers. At our core, what IIPP, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, is for, is to reimagine the role of the state and the policymaker in transforming our economy so it's more inclusive and more sustainable. In particular, we look at directing and boosting innovation and really thinking about innovation and in its role in driving economic growth. There are two key principles which we really hold in our hearts, and the first of those is that innovation doesn't just have a rate, but it also has a direction. As does our economic growth. We can be growing GDP, but in a dirty or clean way. We also really believe that to actually achieve these things, we need to move from a vision of policymakers where they exist only as market fixers, people who step back or stand back and only intervene to direct the private sector away from certain objectives, to a behaviour where the policymakers are much more of a market shaper or even a market creator. And that's particularly important if we're going to transform our economy so it's greener, as we're talking about today. So when I talk there about market shaping and market creating, I think it has a huge amount of overlap with what Stefan said in his opening remarks around demand-side stimulus. It's about looking to the past and how governments have previously managed to drive that, but then developing that into formal policy proposals for the future. What is the relevance of COVID against this backdrop? I think what we can say about the novel coronavirus is that it's drawn attention to the vast inequalities that already existed in our economy and the carbon emissions that are related with our economy. It's shone a light on stakeholder capitalism and perhaps drawn attention to the limits of that model. And it's really demonstrated the reliance of all these sectors upon the state. And it demands that we think about a new model of partnership between the private sector and the public sector. And I hope that people won't criticise me too much for being glib and overlooking the massive negatives and terrible impacts that COVID has had. But it's also a fundamental opportunity for us to look at, for perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, to look at how our economy works and ask real fundamental questions about how we can move it forwards. Fundamentally, it's also really shifted the Overton window, or the window of what's considered acceptable in terms of a policy response. And again, we've all known that decarbonisation and shift towards a greener economy have been too slow to date, and we need to take advantage of this shift in what's considered acceptable in the future. Perhaps we can get into it later, maybe people will agree or disagree, but we would propose that remedying climate change requires a range of coordination and innovation, and that actually states and policymakers, be that international, national or local level, can actually do that incredibly effectively. One thing that I will really particularly draw attention to now before we jump into the wider discussion is that if we're really going to use government policy to drive a green recovery from the COVID crisis, we need to look at the structures that government already have in terms of how they make decisions around what policies to implement and how to coordinate that process. So what I'm talking about there is the mechanisms of policy evaluation and policy appraisal. In the UK, this is housed within something called the Green Book, which is viewed as being the international gold standard of these kind of cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis techniques. The challenge of these is that they're founded upon a vision of the economy where you can actually accurately weigh up the costs and benefits of any effective policy, and a whole range of other restrictions. What we know is that to effectively remedy climate change, we're going to need a huge range of policy interventions across a vast number of different sectors. And actually doing that effectively actually demonstrates that the Green Book process and cost benefit analysis processes can actually be somewhat of a barrier to that. How are they a barrier? Well, at the very top level, they encapsulate a role for the state and for a policymaker where you only intervene to try and stop the private sector doing something, rather than actually view the policymaker as someone who can set a direction or actually create and foster innovation, something which from the past we know governments have done incredibly effectively. But also on a quite micro level, cost-benefit analysis as a policy technique has a range of barriers which are particularly problematic when it comes to green transition. So one would be that CBA, or cost-benefit analysis, relies on accurate estimates of costs and benefits. The UK government has proven that it struggles to predict the cost of offshore wind power 6 months into the future, never mind 25 years, which is the kind of level that we need. Similarly, energy prices have proven to be incredibly difficult to predict as well. CBA also can't account for shifts in demand. So we know we're going to have to invest in new technologies such as electric vehicles, and that will in turn be dependent upon changes in demand. And similarly, that can't be accounted for. And also fundamentally, it biases policymakers towards small-scale interventions. So all of those are somewhat problematic, but I'm also quite interested to dive into some of those potentially in the Q&A. But what we propose is that we need a much more dynamic form of economic evaluation and a different understanding of how our economy can actually be tipped from one equilibrium to another, from where we are today to a much greener and sustainable future, thinking about kind of tipping points along the way. And I think that, as I already said, COVID offers an incredible opportunity for that. And with that, I'll finish up, but very much looking forward to discussing those with both panelists and attendees.
Great, thanks very much for that. That's really interesting to talk about some of the biases that exist in processes that civil servants have to go through to make decisions. I think that's a really important point. If we could move on now to Dan Markham over in Canada. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Kat. It's a pleasure to be with you all today on this. And, I think George and Stefano sort of covered a number of things, but, I think it is really important to look at the context upon which this is happening. It's almost like before we got into COVID, there were already a number of significant issues, whether it be climate change, social inequality, what I'll euphemistically call geopolitical disruptions that were impacting the way people were making economic development type decisions. Then along came COVID, and I suppose my personal opinion, and hopefully I'll be backed up by what happens coming out the back end of this, is that COVID has really been a really great catalyst. I think George sort of hit on this a little bit, where it's exposed significant weaknesses in various parts of our society, socioeconomic fabric, etc. I'm not one of those people that believes it's fundamentally changed the world and the culture and the way people behave forever. I think that once we get either therapeutics or vaccines in place and we've got it behind us, many of the behaviors that people exhibit will go back to normal, such as getting on planes, willing to be close and in much more physically close. And so I think that's an important consideration, because I think there's been lots of discussion around will the economy have fundamentally changed? Will people ever go back? And I think you only have to look to places that have reopened and places maybe that shouldn't reopen, and human behavior is like we're a gregarious group of people. We have been for many millennia, and people will want to gather again, and that's a really important consideration. At Deloitte, we've developed a framework that really looks at COVID in the following manner. Governments, corporations, organizations, what kind, you get in this respond phase, a recover phase, and a thrive phase. Now, like a good consultant, it looks very logical and clean on paper, and it looks like it moves in an orderly fashion from one phase to the next. But of course, we know that's not true. We know that it's much more complex than that. We know that industries, we know that sectors, we know that subsectors and geographies all move through these phases at different paces and at different points in time. But we also know that it's not linear. And so depending on which geography in which you sit, you could be in the US, you could be in Spain, you could be in parts of Canada, you can see that public health is going to dictate if you flip back and forth from seeming to be in recovery to all of a sudden having to respond. And this doesn't even speak of what might happen to be a true second wave of disease. Therefore, I think it's really important as well to realize that depending on what level you look at it, a geography, a sector, an industry, or what have you, you can actually be in all three phases of that at the same time, which seems illogical, but that's certainly the reality. When we look at some of the work that we've done with clients in Canada, just to give you a few examples, we know that hospitality and tourism has been far more impacted than other sectors and industries, like retail, for instance. And if you think about retail as a sector, if you break it into subsectors, food retailers never had to go into the respond and thrive, except for to have to figure out how do you actually supply more and really hence make more revenue. Whereas you contrast that with clothing retailers that for the first 2 or 3 months of this had to shut down because they just couldn't be open because of what we had done to curtail the spread and flatten the curve. And of course, now if I take a Canadian example, since June, the growth in the retail sector has actually rebounded to levels that exceed what was evident back in February of this year and to the levels then. Then when you think about, in some sectors, there are simply structural issues that prevent them from moving from one phase to the next. So once again, if you take the restaurant industry, in a place like Canada where we still have physical distancing in place, you simply cannot operate at full capacity and you can't contribute to the economy until such time as the disease is behind you. And then at a sector level, once again, I'll use Canada as an example because we've got a very, very robust oil and gas sector. And Kat, you had mentioned this, is that how do you move into recovery without disadvantaging a certain sector? And in some cases, in a country the size of Canada, if you disadvantage a sector, you're actually disadvantaging a whole region. So how do you actually move from one sector and emphasize a sector without actually really crippling a particular region of a country? And certainly that would be the case in Canada if we fully turned our back on the oil and gas industry. I think all of this simply underscores one thing, is you have to look at this on a holistic basis. And I think what Stefan had articulated for Germany is a great example of that, about how you have to move at multiple speeds and address different parts of the economy at different times. I'll likewise, and George, I had hoped to be the first person to say it, I actually view this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I thought for a while it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but this truly is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I think, for all of us that are in the public sector and practice in the public sector. And it's really a time for nation building, and at a time, some of the words we've used is, what no regret bets would you make? And certainly I believe that, and we believe that there are bets you can make today that you couldn't have made 6 months ago, but for this catalyst that came along, which is COVID. I think all of this then points to the need to really take a step back. And I think geographies and different countries will have a different structure. You might have a national and then a subnational and a local government. But I think all geographies have to take stock and take a data-driven approach to what is going to work in the recovery, but not just in the recovery, in the long term. And how do you set yourself up for the generations that are ahead? And certainly in that context, we firmly believe in creating that prioritization framework to be able to make those decisions, because at the end of it, you're going to look at what sectors were hit the hardest. How quickly can they come back? What is the relative size? What sort of contribution can those sectors make? That may come in the jobs per $1 million of GDP, or it could come from GDP from the perspective of a certain number of policies or investments that get made. And then certainly the environmental impact of what different no regret bets will you make, and how does the environmental and decarbonization frame into that? And that's going to vary by country. Obviously, with Stefan, Germany's at the one of the leading countries in making those sorts of bets. I think Canada is a bit of a laggard, but is certainly it's one of the things that this government believes in, which is really making a bet that involves decarbonization. So. And there are other dimensions that have to be considered in an economic development strategy, be it inclusive growth, supply chain resiliency, regional execution, and the impacts. And so, ultimately, we look at it from the perspective of you also have to set a comparative. You have to figure out what your comparative advantage is as a region. And when you look at sort of that respond, recover, thrive, there are different types of projects. So respond would be immediate payback. How can you stand things up, prop things up, maintain some level of demand? In a recover context, how do you begin to return the health of economies? So think about it as building competitive advantages and doing things like building those recharging stations. And then thrive is really for that longer term view for what sorts of things would you do. So, and then lastly, I think it's really about unleashing the private sector. So Kat, I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks for that, Daniel. I think it's really important to, talk. Canada is a good case study of looking at sort of impacts on communities, and as you say, avoiding crippling an entire region with changes that aren't thought through properly. Okay, great. Now over to Dr. Laura Altinger. Thanks.
Yes, hello to everybody, and thank you very much for inviting UNDP to this panel. Could you please blend in my first slide? Thanks. So UNDP sees the context of the green recovery very much along the lines of these tipping points for the shift towards the green. First of all, COVID, this echoes also what George and other speakers have said. It's triggered the deepest economic recession since the Great Depression. Global growth is projected down minus 4.9% for 2020, and that's just still preliminary. The worst jobs crisis since the Great Depression, with nearly half of global workers at risk, and also a real danger that this crisis will increase poverty and widen income inequalities, with the impact felt years to come. Secondly, there's a increasing recognition of the climate risks and the biodiversity loss. And the recent IPCC report, the special report on the 1.5 degree warming, shows that we're already seeing the consequences of 1% of global warming through extreme weather, rising sea levels, diminishing Arctic sea ice. It's coming up constantly in the headlines. And also there's an increasing recognition that the shift of investments away from fossil fuels to renewables to achieve the 1.5 degrees of the Paris Agreement on climate change is going to cost around 900 billion in stranded energy assets alone, which is around a third of the current value of the big oil and gas companies. And I think we've very much seen the COVID impact of that on some of the big Shell and BP. And thirdly, we sort of believe that there's also a strong dissatisfaction with the socioeconomic, racial, and gender equalities. We see it in different manifestations. Inequality is growing for over 70% of the global population, and the income disparities and lack of opportunities are creating a vicious cycle of inequality, frustration, and discontent across the generations. Next slide, please. Now, how have the governments reacted in terms of the stimulus? Well, so far, it doesn't look as good as it could. So this is a picture of the G20 stimulus efforts as a reaction to COVID-19 to date. Well, this was end of August, and they've committed about 380 billion US dollars, of which almost half of it was actually spent on fossil fuel energy, supporting fossil fuel energy, whereas only a much smaller proportion was spent on the green. You can see like the 13% unconditionally green and 23% conditionally green. So I think, you know, there's much more to be done to make this the opportunity of a lifetime, and also to learn from those mistakes that we've had from the last crisis, where much of the stimulus was in fact not green. So next slide, please. How has UNDP reacted to this? Well, specifically, we have a rapid financing facility. We had initially a sort of emergency facility for all our country offices and the countries to formulate very rapid recovery plans, and that was mainly income support and these kinds of very spontaneous ad hoc measures to boost the people most affected by the COVID and those sectors as well. But now there's also a rapid financing facility, which is supporting a medium-term outlook of a recovery, and this is supposed to support the COVID 2.0 offer that UNDP has put together, and you can find it on our website. But it should align to the national priorities through the socio-economic impact assessments that are being carried out country by country to identify the priorities and to cost those priorities and those recovery plans. And each country office is being given a certain allocation. And this facility, this RFF facility, is actually meant as a co-investment facility. So countries and other funding and development partners are also co-funding those needs. Now, I think that to cut it very short, because time is of course limited, but you know, as you may know, UNDP of course has the country offices around the world, and there's such a lot of work being done on this green recovery. But I've identified maybe 7 priorities based on discussions that we've had with our country offices, and this also reflects in part the region that I'm working in at the moment, which is the Pan-European region. But of course, I've also been just coming from the Asia-Pacific region a few months ago, and so I've worked there as well. So this also reflects those priorities. But we think that it's important to strengthen the NDCs in particular, which are the instruments under the Climate Paris Agreement, and to raise their ambition through more ambitious targets, emission reduction targets and energy targets, and also to fully integrate the climate response. And at the moment, it's very mitigation heavy. There's some adaptation, but it really needs to incorporate also the adaptation priorities and the nature-based solutions, and also, you know, at least link up to the subnational and cities' climate action. And then we think it's important to actually cost these NDCs and use new taxonomies that exist in order to really understand what constitutes climate adaptation, and use those new methodologies to cost them. And then third, to align these to long-term strategies. So there's a lot of countries already that have committed to net zero strategies, and these need to become totally integrated into the national planning frameworks, and that's only just beginning. Also, we need to strengthen the policy dialogue around the fossil fuel subsidy reform, the carbon taxes, and so on, in order to create the enabling environment. And also, we think that the national, to improve the national climate finance platforms that already exist, and to design new platforms that can implement these plans and catalyze the private sector finance through blended finance is urgently needed. So much more focus on that type of mechanism. And then finally, we need to look at reorienting the financial sector and ensuring ESG integration and Paris alignment of the financial sector and the central bank measures, macroprudential, microprudential measures, and so on, and elaborate on social protection measures for the just transition to make sure that those who are most affected by the transition towards green are also going to be somehow compensated and moving forward. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so UNDP has the Climate Promise, which is a large program. And also we have the Climate Public Expenditure Reviews, and these are all tools and programs that can help to do just those priorities that I've pointed out, to basically implement those measures. And of course, you know, we look forward to working with development partners and countries to really move this agenda forward and take advantage of this COVID to raise the ambition there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Great, thanks for that, Laura. That was really interesting. Very important to bring up the issue of justice there and looking at how to make sure it's a just transition in the long term as well. And now we're going to move over to Sir Suma Chakrabarty. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and hello to fellow panelists and to the audience as well out there. Great to be taking part in this webinar. When you come fifth in a list of distinguished people to speak, the easiest thing would be to say I agree with everything that's been said before me. I have to say I particularly agree with what Laura said in terms of actions that governments should be taking. I think those 7 points are very, very germane, really. But look, I'm going to try and draw a bit on my current experience in ODI, Britain's premier development think tank, but also from my time at EBRD as well, and before that in the British Civil Service. I think it's important to get the context of what's happening in our minds. And Laura did do a great job on that, I think. But what ODI, what we see is, first of all, even before COVID-19, governments were not on track to deliver against the Paris Agreement. One of the problems I think we have as public servants is to remember that governments think in terms of political cycles. 2030 seemed a long way away for many people. And when you're in a crisis now with COVID-19, it probably doesn't seem like the most important issue in your minds. And it's good though in Germany, clearly there is some factoring in of some of the thoughts, even though it's 2 electoral cycles away before the target date. But look, you know, we know that countries, instead of planning, overall countries, instead of planning for a reduction in global fossil fuel production, they were actually planning and projecting a 2% increase per year during this 2020-2030 period. Many countries actually were increasing support for fossil fuel consumption and planning to expand fossil fuel production in late 2019 and early 2020. That's what the ODI research actually shows, and the G20 at the heart of that. There were some glimmers of hope. 13 of the G20 countries had implemented or were implementing carbon pricing schemes, and 5 others were actually assessing carbon pricing schemes. Unfortunately, Australia and India don't either have or not even considering carbon taxes or emission trading schemes. The near-term impacts of COVID are also quite important to take into account here on this green agenda. I think COVID and the associated economic lockdowns have clearly led to very significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sitting here in Oxford in my study, and probably, you know, the cleanest air we've had here in Oxford for some time, and it's really wonderful. But, you know, this is likely to be temporary. I think we need to recognize that, and here Dan, I think, is right that there will be some return to pre-COVID behaviors as well. But I think the biggest thing that's worrying me about the COVID response by governments is actually the responses have tended to intensify patterns that existed prior to the pandemic. Again, the ODI research is showing that jurisdictions that already heavily subsidize the production and consumption of fossil fuels, well, they've actually largely added support to oil, gas, and coal, while those with stronger commitments to a transition to clean energy are now using stimulus and recovery packages to accelerate the shift. In other words, the patterns of behavior that were there in some governments before COVID, bad patterns have been exacerbated, and good patterns have been exacerbated in places like Germany, which are already trying to do the right things. So it hasn't really changed behavior markedly across the piece at all. What can be done about it? Well, I hope at some point, Catherine, I can talk about what an institution like EBRD did actually about it and is doing about it. But at government level, I think the key thing is, first of all, I don't think policymakers are as well aware as they need to be of the benefits of low carbon transition. And one calculation is that these benefits could amount to something like $26 trillion worth of benefits, but they require investment. They require investment of about $2.5 trillion per annum in green power and energy efficiency. That's across the world. We also know from the surveys that certainly EBRD and the World Bank used to carry out that the firms actually need a nudge. And here Dan's point about the private sector being important to this equation is very important indeed. Firms need a nudge. They don't view energy efficiency or green investments as a priority for them. And here governments really do need, as part of the stimulus package, to nudge those firms to provide the incentives to do that. Governments can do it in a number of ways. First of all, they can do, as some governments are doing, targeted credit lines through local banks, really, and through training of local banks as well, to focus on the green economy, indeed public buildings, public transport, those sort of things. Secondly, cities. We know that most growth, most innovation happens actually in cities. But the investments you make in cities, in the built environment, they last for decades, and they can be the biggest source of environmental degradation and pollution. So investment in cities really, in a sense, can determine how sustainable our future is going to be. And here I would urge governments, as part of their stimulus package, to think of green city action plans that would cover all the public services that are polluting: transport, water, wastewater, waste management, heating in many countries as well. A third area, of course, is policy, government policy. And two areas of policy: one we talk about a lot, which is pricing energy properly to phase out energy subsidies. And we know, again, from EBRD's work, that the very best managed firms are also the cleverest at taking a full advantage of energy subsidies, actually. And what we need is for governments to push for improved management practices in high energy intensive sectors, because that will get the biggest bang for buck in terms of reducing fuel intensity. The second area of policy that governments should focus on, I think, is pricing goods on a life cycle basis. And this links a bit to George's point about the Green Book in the UK, the way we do cost benefit analysis as well. Making sure, let's say, the pricing of plastic bottles, things like that, should really reflect what it costs to produce with the correct energy price, and also what it costs to dispose of that plastic safely. And you can have a special tax which is levied to finance the recycling, incineration, and landfill as well. All of that would help reduce the consumption of single-use plastics, one of the worst elements in our lives, of course. The third area, of course, is governments can really push for environmental standards, disclosures, energy consumption standards for buildings, for appliances, for vehicles. This is done in many countries, of course, and I'm sure Stefan can give examples in Germany of how they do that. But a lot of other countries haven't yet adopted those disclosure standards as well. They can really help. The final point everyone will make is about global coordination and the need to really actually hold the Paris Agreement together. And that's really important to do so. But I think there's a range of actions government can take and should try to take. I mean, I had an interesting interview with Gordon Brown when I was at EBRD in the first days of lockdown, and he was lamenting the fact that when the financial crisis hit, nearly 13 years ago, 14 years ago, not enough was done to build in green elements into the stimulus packages that governments were putting through. And it was a missed opportunity. We just mustn't miss this opportunity again. It's really important we now try and address it in every single country to try and actually get on top of this agenda. I hope that gives you a sense of where I think my thinking is on this. I hope I can also, at some point in the Q&A, maybe say a bit about what EBRD did to reboot itself as an institution that really focused on the green economy.
Great, thanks very much for that. That was really interesting, especially your insight there on your conversation with Gordon Brown on comparisons with the last financial crisis are very pertinent, I think. Okay, so we can move on to the Q&A section now. So we've had a few questions that have come in, but carry on with those and we'll pick them up as we go through. First of all, I was wondering if panelists could provide their thoughts on what they think the biggest threats to this agenda are and how those can be addressed by governments.
I'm happy to go first if no one else wants to jump in. I think we've already picked up on it, and I mentioned it, and I think Dan mentioned it too. I think not so much a challenge, but just a property of the system, which will be very difficult as things return to normal, is the return to normal. There is going to be an almost relentless pressure from companies who have suspended production or who have laid off staff or maybe temporarily furloughed them to return to business as usual. And I think that is a massive risk to really seizing the opportunity, which I think both I and the other participants have all alluded to. I came through an airport this week, 2 days ago, and it's incredibly quiet. You know, Suma pointed out that road traffic is incredibly low. We're already seeing some benefits of the reduction in in the economy, but if we don't find a way to capitalize on this today and give answers to those companies, which obviously want to continue and return to normal, but give solutions to allow them to do so in a clean way, then we will really fail to capitalize on this incredible opportunity to try and make up lost time on our emissions towards the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
Yeah, Kat, I was going to pick up, and I was maybe going to pick up on a couple things something that Suma said as well, which is, I think there's a few things that will combine to be the threat. So, number one is looking at the past for solutions, right? It's somewhat akin to driving your car by looking in the rearview mirror. I'm pretty sure none of us would actually do that. I think we should learn from the mistakes that we made, and I think there are things that worked in 2008, 2009, and certainly that's what we've been telling all of our clients. There was lots of money went into infrastructure, but infrastructure was very, at least in the Canadian context, was very loosely defined. We quite often say, going and putting a coat of paint on a public building or building a gazebo in a park, that's not infrastructure, and it doesn't create sustainable, positive net economic output. Neither does it do anything to actually reduce the carbon footprint. And I think the other thing is, how do we get beyond looking at, and Sue, I think you said this as well, the political cycle. I mean, it's inevitable in anything where a government's involved, but I think the danger is not painting what good looks like, so people can look beyond what is in the art of really painting what the art of the possible is. Because if we don't do that, if we don't actually just take that step back and look at some of the structural things that we've learned. I said it before. I think I was probably a bit polite. I think George was probably a little bit more direct. I mean, I think we see some really big tears in our social fabric, and that should bring us all lots of caution and should really make us look at ourselves. There's a question in their questions, which we can touch on as well, about basic income, but basic income might actually be one of the things that allows us to focus on things like a better green recovery and a better green outcome. And certainly we can talk about how that might be, but I think all of these things are interrelated. It's very complex. I think the danger is going to be, if we just go back to what we used to do and we don't really take that step back and really look at ourselves and figure out how do we do something really different this time. It's a great opportunity to do that. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel. Maybe we could look at a bit why some organizations have prioritized green economy more than others, and how other organizations and governments can learn from that. I think, Suma, you had some points to make on that from your time at EBRD.
Thanks, Catherine. I think EBRD is not a special case, but people often tend to think of it as, because it started out as a special case because it was working really to try and help the economies of the former communist bloc become market economies. And it was created in early 91, and 92 we were all going to Rio for at least I was, for the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And it got written into the EBRD's mandate that it should focus on the environment, and also because it had one of the most energy intensive polluting parts of Europe to deal with at the time. But what I think has transformed EBRD is the concept of what is a market economy. First of all, 3 or 4 years ago, we rewrote what we thought a market economy should be. It was no longer about just being competitive, as it would have been in the early 90s, in the Washington Consensus years. We wrote 6 different characteristics. I won't go through them all, but one, and central to it, was green. So that became, and secondly, to George's point, that changed the methodology by which we looked at projects at EBRD. In other words, you really had to have green as central to the project analysis appraisal, and in order to get a project approved. Thirdly, I should say, against the instincts of some of my shareholders, we went for a target which is very, very ambitious. We said by 2020, 40% of all EBRD investments would be in the green economy space. And the other 60 would not be against green, but they wouldn't have green as a primary focus, but 40% would have green as primary focus. We got to 46% last year, so already well ahead. And incentives matter in institutions. So resetting incentives for public servants to actually make them, those who do well on this will go further in the institution. Human behavior does tend to adjust, particularly with bankers. That certainly made a big difference, I think, as well. We also then developed a number of financial products that would help to scale up mitigation, adaptation, and environmental finance based on what clients needed. And we began to be able to show to our private sector clients that the payback period, for example, in investing in green technology was much better than they had thought. And because pricing was coming down, the technology was advancing. So you look at solar or wind pricing, huge changes. And that was an information failure that we helped correct with many of our clients as well. And then finally, I think building up the policy activity within the institution to really try and actually make markets. I think one of our co-panelists say that it wasn't just about responding to markets, but actually trying to create a market for these environmental products. The result is extraordinary. I mean, the EBRD has doubled green finance within 7 years. The ratio, as I said, is 46% last year. So annually, I think the EBRD now, its projects reduce carbon emissions, I think over 53 million tons a year, which is actually the same annual reduction that a mid-sized European country, Bulgaria, Portugal, Norway, each of them would, their annual emissions reduction. So it's an astonishing change, as well as policy changes about what we finance as well, that made, I think, EBRD quite a leader, particularly in the private sector, which again, going back to Dan's point, is the motor of the economy. And it's really focusing on that. And I think it can be done, and it can be done in national governments too, if you reboot, having a mandate that is focused on the environment, and then having incentives and structures and skills in each of the institutions that is rebooted to really focus on green. EBRD has really succeeded, and it's now, I think, held up amongst the other multilateral banks as an example of where to go in this space. But I think it can work for other institutions too.
Okay, great. Thanks, Suma. Have any of the other panelists got any organisations or governments that they've seen sort of good examples of how they've brought forward green economic plans and what worked well and why?
Well, sorry, if I could maybe take that. I mean, there are just simply countless examples across the world showing, for example, carbon trading schemes or voluntary carbon market schemes that have led to conservation and funding for conservation and this. So there are many different schemes. I actually wanted to take one of the questions from the Q&A because I just thought it fit very nicely with what Sir Suma just has said. One of the questions is about the developing countries, and they need, of course, the finance, and what can agencies like the World Bank and the UNDP do, and of course that speaks to me. And I think Sir Suma has just answered it from the perspective of Multilateral Development Bank, which is the EBRD, and of course they work in a certain part of the world, but the World Bank is global and it does similar work. As a matter of fact, I worked there for 4 years. I think what UNDP does for developing countries in particular is we work closely with the government counterparts to develop specific proposals for GCF and the vertical funds, the GEF, Adaptation Fund, the least developed least developed climate fund, countries fund, and then and we basically have a portfolio now of many billions of dollars of these vertical funds across the world, and we basically support the countries to get to channel the money to them through these proposals, and then also help the countries to implement and especially supervise the implementation. So I think that's one key avenue where we work, and one other one that I'll mention because I'm wary of the time is the new climate investment platform, which is a very interesting platform that we've created together with Sustainable Energy for All, and also together with the IRENA, which is the Renewable Energy Agency, and the Green Climate Fund. And this is a very nice partnership which has 4 tracks. It looks at raising the climate targets in the context of the NDCs. It focuses on policy and regulation, which is kind of also speaking to some of Sir Suma's points, and doing some financial de-risking and helping to access the capital markets for countries. So I think it's a very promising, brand new climate investment platform. Look it up. I think it's about to go operational, and I think it will really help to channel some additional finance and leverage the private sector finance for the energy transition. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Laura. Thanks for picking that question up. I was about to direct that one at you anyway. So, fantastic. Well, I was wondering, another question that's come in from the audience is about how governments should look at livelihoods and well-being in terms of designing and delivering their strategies, and should recovery approaches look at work and productivity differently, and maybe consider things like basic income grants that have been experimented in a couple of places. That's a question from Georgina Ryan at the Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa. Any thoughts on that one? Basic income grants? I think someone mentioned that one earlier in their answer.
I feel obliged to answer that one because UNDP has just come up with a very big initiative on the basic income, and please look it up on our website. But yeah, I can't really speak in detail to it because it's not something I've been too involved in, but it's taking hold very much amongst the governments that we're talking to, and it's become a flagship initiative led by Achim Steiner, our head, And so I think it's certainly very promising. And there's now been a lot of support also through our rapid financing work on the basic incomes, and it seems a promising avenue for many countries.
I would also like to just pick up that kind of link between well-being, productivity, how we actually look at the way the economy works. And I think it goes to another one of the questions in the Q&A there around what does COVID have to do with green economic plans. I mean, fundamentally, what COVID has done is flipped upside down quite a lot of the basic fundamentals of our economy or economies. So particularly in the UK, very much the rhetoric around where growth comes from has been around the private sector and around business growing, etc., which is incredibly important, of course. But suddenly we've had this swing back towards the concept of key workers and people who are the foundation of our economy, which everything else is built upon. And I think that question of then thinking about bringing well-being, thinking about the way that people live their lives, thinking around the way that then feeds into the economy. Because in the UK, we've had a problem with productivity for quite some time, and you know, it's a big puzzle why our productivity has become disconnected from economic growth. But there are questions there around precarity of individuals within the economy, which are fundamentally linked into their well-being, and they've really had the spotlight shone on them by COVID. You know, we've seen that economic inequality and economic precarity are also fundamentally linked into your likelihood to get COVID, get coronavirus, and to have worse health outcomes from it. So I think that all of these things are quite intimately connected, but our policymakers and politicians, I haven't seen a kind of anyone really be able to tell that story and to speak about the response to that. So I think it's an incredible challenge as we think about recovery from COVID.
Great, thanks, George. Dr. Stefan, do you have anything to add on that? Is Germany thinking about that in any way?
I mean, so far there's studies and some projects with a couple of hundred of people where a basic income is tested, but not at a large scale so far. Of course, we also do have the discussion here, also with regards to further digitalization of the economy and all these things. But it reminds me of another policy that is also part of not of the recovery package, but that was also implemented after the coronavirus hit. And that is the so-called short-time work allowance. That means if a company gets into trouble because of Corona, and then either they have to lay off people, or they let everybody work a little less. And in order to compensate for salaries that the workers lose in that time, the government gives a certain amount of a bonus, a short-time work allowance. And I think that is a policy we learned more than 10 years ago in the financial crisis that works really well in order to prevent companies from firing people only because of a short-term crisis, and then having problems to get them back in the company like a year later. So besides this discussion about basic income, sometimes it helps, I think, if government supports companies to get through a short period of time, keep the people in the company, don't fire them, let them work a little less, get some extra money from the government in order to compensate the loss, and then you'll be ready to go right after the crisis. And that's something that has been tested or has been adopted more than 10 years ago in the financial crisis, and now again. And I think that is a lesson learned, certainly.
Okay, great, thanks. That's really interesting. And also that kind of thing massively affects public acceptance of of changes and transitions that societies and economies are going through. Which brings me on to another question that I have from the audience from Canada. So I think this one is one for you, Dan. And this is about carbon pricing. And the question is, I think a political trend we see in Canada regarding carbon pricing is that when government introduced the carbon tax, it resulted in significantly reduced support from voters and simply increased the cost of living and business operations. So for countries like Canada that don't have lots of green infrastructure like electric charging stations and have high electricity costs, what can governments do to incentivize consumers to transform the economy?
How long do we have? It's a killer question. I wish I would have had the answer. But unfortunately, the concept of carbon pricing has just become very politicized. I mean, I don't really care what political stripes people come from. It doesn't really matter, but it's become this political thing. And it's almost like if one person says it, the other person has to say it. It's not a good thing. And the reality is, if you looked at what most economists would say, certainly what our chief economist would say, from an efficiency perspective, it's exactly the right tool for the job. And yes, it does serve that is part of its intention is to increase the cost. And so it becomes a much more user-pay system. If you live in North America or in Canada to a lesser extent the United States, you do not pay the true cost of gasoline. You just don't. You may think you do, but you don't. So if you want to look at the true cost of petrol or gasoline or whatever it is you call it, go to the United Kingdom and fill up your car. It's going to cost you significantly more. And I think North Americans in particular are used to not paying the full freight. And I think, that kind of gets into that concept of, well, maybe people will vote against these things there's not political support because they see their personal costs rise. And that's just because we're conditioned to be not paying the full freight. So how do we actually, I think, make people aware of the total cost that they're actually imparting upon society as a whole? We also, and from an economics perspective in Canada, our chief economist here, we completely agree. One of the things that is missing in the Canadian context is how do we just produce more electricity without doing it in a way that has a heavy carbon footprint. We just don't have enough, which is why the price of it is the way that it is. And so when you look at green infrastructure, we're likewise proponents of electrification, whether it be electrification of transportation networks or whether it be electrification of vehicles. Those are the types of things that, frankly, in Canada we could use more of, and I think it fits into that. If you think about it, if I go back to the framework of respond and recover, that fits really nicely into the beginning, into the first two of those, rather than the thrive phase, because you can do that in the short term. So, quite often you'll hear in infrastructure terms, people use the term shovel ready. We don't like that term. We like shovel appropriate, because shovel ready generally denotes, you're going to do more of the same, which isn't a good thing. But shovel appropriate is certainly something that we think the electrification of transportation grids as well as personal vehicles is something that is it's high time to do that here.
Okay, great, thanks. Does anyone else have any thoughts on carbon pricing and consumer attitudes in general? That's what the question was really getting down to. No? Okay. There's one question that came in before the webinar started from the audience, which was about how can governments deal with misinformation campaigns and vested interests from those still invested in oil, coal and gas. It's a question that came in from the UK. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on governments obviously at the moment to give money in certain directions. So how can they best deal with that? Anyone got any thoughts? Okay, well, I can move on to my last question, which I would like to ask each of the panelists what changes you could make to civil service skills, working methods, or processes that could best enable governments to realise the green potential of economic stimulus packages. And yeah, I think that could bring up a few of the things that you've mentioned earlier. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump on that grenade if you like. Initially, I'll be fairly brief. So I think from my perspective, given that I work as a consultant with public servants, my view is that we need to find a way to unleash them. And I think there's a number of things that we can do there. I think that most government is sitting on a treasure trove of data and on assets that they either don't know they exist or they haven't actually made better use of them. And I think there's a real job to be done there across government to use the data that is collected and to be able to put it in the hands of people, irrespective of what department or ministry or what have you that they work in. And I think along those lines is I mentioned before, I don't believe COVID is this like big thing that's fundamentally changed the world. It's highlighted things and it's a catalyst to observe things and weaknesses. And I think one of the things that we see across government, and we see it in organizations, so this isn't a comment on government, you see it in corporations as well, which is the lack of what I'll call horizontal communication across departments. So like I say, departments, ministries, et cetera. So if you think about one level of government, the federal government, not enough communication across departments, not enough coordination between departments, and you see people going in different directions. It's really hard because they're big, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it. And I think in countries like Canada, we have multiple levels of government. Then you've got a vertical integration that needs to be addressed as well, because we have federal, provincial, local, and I think coordinating that effort is also really important. So I think just a general theme on unleashing the power of the public sector, and then how do you organizationally try to really break down the silos that exist either vertically or horizontally.
Can I jump in there as well before all my ideas get said already? Because I'm very similar to Dan's again. I think that the shape of government today, essentially large vertical departments, just presents serious organizational problems in terms of actually answering big systemic economic or societal challenges. So one piece of work that we did at IIPP was to work very closely with the UK's industrial strategy team within government and direct it towards what they call their grand challenges. So one of those was green and sustainability, but also topics around the future of mobility, healthy aging, and an AI and data economy. And what we found is that almost all of those cut across every department. So finding effective ways of breaking down those silos within government and creating teams which can draw on expertise and knowledge across government and then present and leverage policy initiatives to answer them is absolutely critical in terms of systems and behaviours of policymakers to effectively talk about climate change. And there are a multitude of examples of this. In the UK, again, the business department has climate change within its remit, but all transport systems is within the Department for Transport. Thinking about food is within the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. All of these different policy areas that we know we're going to have to address separately to transform our economy are spread across government. And finding ways to actually have those agile capabilities to break down those potentially siloed, vertically systemic departments and work horizontally towards big societal challenges is absolutely essential.
Could I come in there as well, Catherine?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
I agree completely with the data and all this. Although I wouldn't say I wouldn't use the treasure trove, because then governments will want to sell it and it will become even more difficult to access the data. But to make it publicly available, I think is very important, and this vertical and horizontal integration. But also, like in terms of this integration, I think it's very important that the economic policymakers are really very much involved, because these issues aren't environmental issues, really. I mean, they're actually economic issues. And I see a trend amongst the countries that we serve to bring like the whole climate portfolio into the Ministry of Economy, for example. And you can have many examples of that now across the world. And I think that that's also very much a step up, because it means that, you know, the finance ministers and the ministries of economy and all those decision makers that are making decisions on the public budgets are much more understanding of the, you know, the bigger climate change and sustainability challenge. So that would be another thing that I would sort of recommend.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura.
Can I come in?
Yes, of course.
So, I mean, I'm drawing on my past in the British civil service here. I think fundamentally, civil servants have got to be proactive, not reactive. They've got to be on transmit, not receive on this agenda, and which would mean they have to work out why pushing this agenda should matter to politicians and make a case for why it is actually enhancing to political careers and political futures, and not just waiting for electoral cycles close to 2030. And I think within that, they need to find one or two allies within the administration. I think it's quite an interesting idea, building on what both George and Laura said, is to think about a cabinet level Secretary of State who is working across departments. This is a cross-cutting issue. And potentially you could, in the British system, think about the Chancellor doing that, actually. So giving the Chancellor the climate change remit, because a lot of the decisions have to be also enabled through the tax and spend system. We don't tend to do that. What we tend to do in the UK is have a climate czar who's going to be sort of trying to make COP26 happen, but that person has absolutely no levers at all. And it's immaterial to the careers of his or her colleagues in cabinet. So you have to think about the personal incentives or political incentives a lot more, and civil servants need to do that a lot more than they traditionally do. Second thing I would do is actually, this is something where I do think the critique of the British civil service has some truth in it, which is it doesn't do science as much as it should do. You know, I'm another one of these economists, but I think we lack actually respect within the system for climate science particularly. And I think pushing that more from the Cabinet Secretary, the new Cabinet Secretary, would be a good thing in the UK to do. And thirdly, the whole question George started off with on incentives, assessment methodologies, and so on, whereby you actually privilege investments within the British system that are green related over other investments. I think that would be very fundamental as well to do that. So those are three things I would really ask civil servants in the UK to focus on for the future.
Okay, great, thanks. And Stefan, do you want to jump in there?
Maybe a learning from the machine room of such a recovery program, so to say. I think a green recovery program and also the energy transition in general is not only an economic issue or a legal issue. It becomes more and more also a technical, a moral, a communication issue, a political science issue, an engineering issue. So I think what we learned is that interdisciplinary cooperation and different backgrounds of civil servants coming from all different academic backgrounds are really helpful in order to understand and put together a recovery program. And I think also shows this webinar, I don't know your backgrounds, but I assume that we don't have all the same backgrounds, and I think it's always good to have some degree of heterogeneity in order to have a fruitful discussion.
Great, okay, thanks for that, Stefan. It's a good point to end on there. And yeah, with that, we're out of time. Thanks very much to our panel, to our knowledge partner, Deloitte, and to everyone for watching. In a couple of weeks, we'll be sending out a link to a recording of the session and also a write-up. So look out for that in your inboxes. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.